Montana Territory, 1878. The dusty frontier town of Willow Creek clung to the edge of civilization, a place where hope battled desperation with each passing day. Sheriff Hayes Barton stood on the weathered boardwalk outside his office, watching the mail coach approach through a haze of summer heat. At 26, he was younger than most lawmen in the territory, but the residents respected his steady hand and unwavering sense of justice. Hayes adjusted his badge, the metal warm against his chest. 6 years of keeping peace had taught him one immutable truth. Attachment was a luxury no lawman could afford. Every friend was leverage for an enemy. Every love was a target waiting to be exploited. He'd seen good men buried because they let their guard down, because they chose sentiment over vigilance. Mails in early, called Jasper, the aging telegraph operator, limping past with his cane tapping a rhythm on the wooden planks. Hayes nodded, squinting at the approaching coach. Anything I should know about? Just that mail-order bride for Donovan. Been the talk of the town for weeks. Hayes frowned. Love by correspondence seemed a fool's gamble, especially in a place like Willow Creek where winter storms could last for months and summer droughts could starve a family in weeks. The frontier broke most who came seeking fortune or romance. It had taught Hayes that survival meant independence. No attachments, no distractions, just the clear focus of a man who needed nothing and no one. The coach rattled to a stop before the general store, dust billowing around the weathered wheels. Hayes watched dispassionately as the driver secured the reins and moved to open the door. From his vantage point, Hayes could see a slender hand reach out, accepting assistance to descend. She emerged like a vision from another world, a young woman with honey blonde hair pinned beneath a modest blue bonnet that matched her traveling dress. Even from a distance, Hayes could see she was beautiful in a refined, Eastern way that seemed impossibly out of place against Willow Creek's weathered storefronts. She looked to be about 20, though her posture suggested a maturity beyond her years. "That'll be Miss Sinclair," Jasper muttered, following Hayes' gaze. "Poor thing's come all the way from Boston to marry a man she's never met." Hayes shook his head. "Another tenderfoot who'll be on the next coach east once she sees what frontier life really means." But something about the way she stood, straight-backed and calm as the driver unloaded her trunk, made Hayes pause. Most Eastern women arrive teary-eyed or visibly fearful. This one surveyed her surroundings with quiet assessment, her chin lifted slightly, as though she were cataloging challenges rather than shrinking from them. When she turned slightly, Hayes caught a better glimpse of her face, heart-shaped with delicate features and wide blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Something stirred in his chest, an unfamiliar sensation he quickly suppressed. Attachment was weakness. He'd learned that lesson watching his father die trying to protect his mother during a homestead raid when Hayes was just 14. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Hayes' attention away from the newcomer. Wade Donovan, the town's most prosperous cattle rancher, rode toward the stage, his expensive clothes and well-groomed appearance setting him apart from most of Willow Creek's residents. At 38, Donovan had built an empire through ruthless determination and strategic marriages to wealthy widows who conveniently didn't survive long. His third wife had passed 6 months ago, and the town had buzzed with speculation when he'd announced he'd sent for a bride from back east. "She's younger than I expected," Jasper remarked. "And prettier," Hayes added, a sour taste forming in his mouth as he watched Donovan dismount and approach the woman. "God help her." The young woman, Miss Sinclair, extended her gloved hand to Donovan, who took it with the practiced charm that had won him influence throughout the territory. Hayes couldn't hear their exchange, but he saw the flash of confusion cross her face, quickly masked by polite composure. That was when Hayes noticed a second man approaching, Luke Donovan, Wade's younger brother, a hard-working cowboy who managed the day-to-day operations of the ranch while Wade handled business affairs. Unlike his brother's tailored suit, Luke wore simple work clothes, his face weathered from long days in the saddle, though he couldn't have been more than 25. The confusion made sudden sense. Hayes stepped from the boardwalk, drawn toward the unfolding scene by instinct rather than intention. "You must be mistaken, Miss Sinclair," Wade was saying as Hayes approached. "The letters were from me, Wade Donovan, owner of the Broken D Ranch." "But the letters were signed L. Donovan," the woman replied, her voice cultured but firm. "And they described a man who works with cattle, not a businessman. Luke Donovan stepped forward, his expression a mix of confusion and dawning realization. Miss, I never wrote to any mail-order bride service. The young woman pulled a bundle of letters from her reticule, her hands steady despite the mounting tension. These letters, sir, signed L. Donovan from the Broken D Ranch in Willow Creek, Montana Territory. Her gaze shifted between the brothers. They spoke of open skies and honest work, of building something meaningful together. Wade snatched the letters, scanning them with narrowed eyes before turning a venomous glare toward his brother. You've been using my paper and letterhead. I never wrote these, Luke protested, though uncertainty flickered across his face. Let me see. The handwriting is clearly an attempt to mimic yours, Wade cut in, addressing the young woman while keeping the letters out of Luke's reach. Some prank or swindle. Regardless, the arrangement stands. I sent for a bride, and you've arrived. Hayes stepped closer, noting the way Miss Sinclair's fingers tightened around her reticule. Everything all right here? 3 pairs of eyes turned to him. The woman's gaze was direct and assessing, showing no trace of tears despite her evident distress. Sheriff Barton, Wade acknowledged with a tight smile. Just a minor misunderstanding with my fiancée. Miss Lydia Sinclair, allow me to introduce our local lawman. Sheriff, she greeted him with a slight nod. I appear to have found myself in an unexpected situation. The man I corresponded with seems not to be the man I expected. Miss Sinclair believes she was writing to my brother, Wade explained smoothly. A simple confusion about the signature, nothing more. Hayes looked at the letters still clutched in Wade's hand, then to Luke's bewildered expression, and finally to Miss Sinclair's composed but troubled features. Those letters describe a life I have no intention of providing, Wade continued, his voice hardening. I require a wife to manage my household and social affairs, not some romantic partner for building a humble homestead. Then I believe our arrangement is void, Lydia stated firmly, though Hayes noted the slight tremor in her hands. I will need to make other arrangements. After I've paid your passage, contracted with the agency, Wade's charm slipped, revealing the calculating businessman beneath. You'll find that legally binding, Miss Sinclair. Hayes saw the flash of fear in her eyes, quickly masked by determination. A tenderfoot Eastern woman alone in the Montana Territory had few options, especially one who'd arrived as a mail-order bride. The lady says the arrangement is void, Hayes found himself saying, surprising even himself. And I believe Montana territorial law requires mutual consent for such contracts to be valid. Wade's expression darkened. Stay out of private matters, Sheriff. When they spill onto my main street, they become my concern. Hayes turned to Lydia. Miss Sinclair, Willow Creek has a small boarding house that would be suitable while you consider your options. Lydia Sinclair looked at Hayes with an expression he couldn't quite read. Relief, yes, but also wariness, as though she'd learned not to trust offered assistance. Thank you, Sheriff. That would be most appropriate. This isn't over, Wade said, his voice low enough that only Hayes could hear as Lydia moved to speak with the stage driver about her trunk. For now, it is, Hayes replied evenly, keeping his hand casually near his holster. Unless you'd like to discuss your business practices more formally in my office. Wade's jaw tightened, but he backed away, mounting his horse with fluid grace that belied his anger. Luke, come along. We have actual work to attend to. Luke hesitated, looking at Lydia with evident confusion. Miss Sinclair, I truly don't know anything about those letters, but, Luke? Now, Wade's command cut through the air like a whip. With a last apologetic glance at Lydia, Luke mounted his own horse and followed his brother out of town. Hayes watched them go, then turned to find Lydia Sinclair studying him with those clear blue eyes. Sheriff Barton, she said quietly, I appreciate your intervention, but I should inform you that I have precisely $18.43 to my name, which will not sustain me long at any boarding house. Hayes nodded, unexpected respect blooming for her direct honesty. Mrs. Miller charges $4 weekly for room and board. The general store needs help with inventory, and Doc Parsons mentioned needing assistance organizing his records. Between the two, you could manage until you decide your next steps. Lydia's shoulders relaxed slightly. You're very kind to a stranger, Sheriff. It's my job to keep the peace, he replied automatically. Is it your job to rescue mail-order brides from unsuitable matches? A reluctant smile tugged at his lips. First time for everything, Miss Sinclair. Something shifted in her expression, a hint of warmth that made Hayes acutely aware of her beauty. Well, then I'm fortunate it was your first time today, Sheriff Barton. As he escorted her to the boarding house, Hayes told himself his actions were simply maintaining order in his town. Nothing more. Attachment was still weakness, and he'd built his life on staying detached, untouchable. But as Lydia Sinclair glanced up at him with quiet gratitude, Hayes felt something inside him stir, a dangerous longing he'd thought long buried beneath years of carefully constructed solitude. 3 weeks passed, and Lydia Sinclair proved herself anything but the helpless tenderfoot Hayes had initially expected. She secured work at both the general store and the doctor's office, impressing townsfolk with her efficiency and quick intelligence. The women of Willow Creek, initially suspicious of the beautiful Easterner, gradually warmed to her as she joined quilting circles and attended Sunday services without airs or pretension. Hayes found himself increasingly aware of her movements through town. The way she walked with purpose each morning to the general store, her honey blonde hair neatly braided, her simple dresses always pressed despite their growing signs of wear. He told himself his attention was merely professional concern for a newcomer in his jurisdiction, especially one who'd arrived under complicated circumstances. But when their paths crossed, as they inevitably did in a town Willow Creek size, Hayes found himself lingering in conversation longer than necessary, offering insights about Montana that went beyond his official duties. The winters here can kill the unprepared, he warned one evening as he walked her back to the boarding house after she'd finished late at Doc Parsons' office. You'll need heavier clothing before the first snow. Lydia smiled, her face illuminated by the golden light spilling from the saloon windows they passed. Are you suggesting I won't last the winter, Sheriff Barton? Most don't, he replied honestly. The territory breaks more dreams than it fulfills. And what of your dreams? She asked, catching him off guard. Did Montana break them or fulfill them? Hayes hesitated. I stopped dreaming a long time ago, Miss Sinclair. Found it safer that way. Safer, perhaps, but hardly living. Her voice held no judgment, only a quiet observation that unsettled him more than criticism would have. Before he could respond, they were interrupted by Luke Donovan, who emerged from the shadows of the livery stable. Miss Sinclair, Luke called, approaching with his hat in his hands. Might I have a word? Hayes tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward his holster, but Lydia placed a gentle hand on his arm. It's all right, Sheriff. Mr. Donovan has been nothing but respectful in our previous encounters. Hayes reluctantly stepped back, but remained within earshot as Luke spoke. Miss Sinclair, I've been doing some investigating about those letters, Luke said, his expression earnest in the lamplight. I believe my brother may have. That is, Wade has an associate in his employ who's skilled at forgery. I think he may have had those letters written in a style meant to resemble mine. Lydia's posture stiffened. For what purpose? Wade needs to marry before the years end to secure his claim on a parcel of land that belonged to his late wife's family, Luke explained. There's a clause in the inheritance requiring him to be married. His reputation has spread enough that local families won't allow their daughters near him, and he doesn't have time to court properly. So he lured an Eastern woman with false promises, Lydia concluded, her voice steady despite the color rising in her cheeks. I believe so, yes. And I wanted you to know I had no part in it. Luke twisted his hat in his hands. I also wanted to warn you. Wade doesn't give up what he considers his. Be careful. Hayes stepped forward. Is that a threat, Donovan? A warning, Sheriff, Luke replied, meeting his gaze. My brother's ruthless when it comes to business, and he considers Miss Sinclair an investment now. After Luke departed, Hayes walked Lydia the remaining distance to the boarding house in silence, her earlier question about dreams forgotten in the weight of this new information. At the boarding house steps, Lydia paused. Sheriff Barton, Hayes, he corrected, surprising himself. If we're discussing threats against your safety, you might as well use my given name. A small smile touched her lips. Hayes, then. And I'm Lydia. Her expression grew serious. Do you believe I'm in danger? Hayes considered her question carefully. Wade Donovan is used to getting what he wants. He's never been violent that I know of, but he's influential. Might make staying in Willow Creek difficult for you. Lydia's chin lifted in that determined way he'd come to admire. I've faced difficulty before, Sheriff. It doesn't frighten me nearly as much as the thought of being that man's wife. What will you do? Continue working. Save enough for passage elsewhere, perhaps. She studied his face in the soft lamplight. Unless you're suggesting I should leave sooner? The thought of Lydia leaving created an unexpected hollowness in Hayes' chest. Just be careful, he said finally, and let me know if anything happens that concerns you. As he walked back toward his office, Hayes tried to ignore the growing realization that his interest in Lydia Sinclair had long since passed beyond professional duty. For the first time in years, the isolation he'd cultivated felt less like protection and more like an empty room with the door locked from inside. Autumn painted the Montana landscape in brilliant golds and reds as September gave way to October. Lydia's position in town solidified as she proved herself both capable and kind, helping deliver Mrs. Peterson's baby when the doctor was called away, organizing a harvest celebration that brought together even the most reclusive homesteaders, and teaching reading to several ranch hands in evening sessions at the church. Hayes found himself seeking her company with increasing regularity, first with transparent excuses about town safety, then gradually with more honest invitations to share meals or Sunday afternoon walks. "You never finished telling me about Boston," he said during one such walk along the creek that gave the town its name. The late afternoon sun caught the golden strands in her hair, and Hayes forced himself to look at the water instead. "There's not much more to tell," Lydia replied, carefully picking her way across some stones. "After my parents died of influenza, I lived with my aunt, who made it clear I was an unwelcome burden. When she arranged a marriage to a man 30 years my senior, who looked at me like, well," she shuddered slightly, "I decided answering a matrimonial advertisement couldn't possibly be worse." Hayes offered his hand to help her across a particularly uneven section. Brave decision for a 20-year-old woman alone. 23, actually, she corrected with a smile, accepting his hand. "Though I'm flattered you thought me younger." Her touch lingered longer than necessary, and Hayes found himself reluctant to release her. "What did you imagine you'd find out here?" Lydia's expression grew thoughtful. The letters described building something meaningful together. Partnership, not ownership. That's what appealed to me most. She glanced at him. "I think I wanted freedom more than romance, though the letters hinted at the possibility of both." "And now?" Hayes asked, aware they had stopped walking, standing close beside the burbling creek. "Now I find myself wondering if what I was seeking might be found in places I never expected." Her eyes met his, and Hayes felt something inside him shift, like ice breaking on a spring river. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibility, until the distant sound of approaching riders broke the spell. Hayes instinctively stepped in front of Lydia as Wade and Luke Donovan appeared around the bend, accompanied by two ranch hands Hayes recognized as Wade's most loyal enforcers. "Well, isn't this cozy?" Wade called, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Our sheriff and my wayward bride, enjoying nature's splendor." "Miss Sinclair is under no obligation to you, Donovan." Hayes responded evenly, though he could feel tension coiling through his body. Wade dismounted, his movements deliberate. "That's where you're wrong, Sheriff. I have contracts with the matrimonial agency, receipts for her passage west. Legally binding documents that a lawman such as yourself should respect. Any contract made under false pretenses is void," Lydia stated, stepping beside Hayes rather than remaining behind him. "You misrepresented yourself deliberately." Wade's expression hardened. "I've been patient, allowing you time to adjust to frontier life. That patience has limits." He gestured to one of his men, who tossed a folded paper to Hayes. "Notice of complaint filed with the territorial magistrate, citing breach of contract and requesting compensation for expenses incurred." Hayes unfolded the document, his stomach tightening as he scanned its contents. "This claims $500 in damages. A considerable sum for a woman with no family connections," Wade observed smoothly. "Of course, I'd be willing to withdraw the complaint in exchange for Miss Sinclair fulfilling our original arrangement." Lydia's face paled, but her voice remained steady. "I would rather work the rest of my life to repay that amount than spend one day as your wife." Hayes saw the dangerous flash in Wade's eyes before his expression smoothed into calculated pleasantness. "Perhaps you'll reconsider when you find yourself unemployed. Willow Creek is a small town, Miss Sinclair, and I have considerable influence with its merchants." "Are you threatening her livelihood?" Hayes demanded, hand moving to his holster. Wade smiled thinly. Simply stating facts, Sheriff. Business arrangements shift constantly on the frontier. He turned back to his horse. You have until the end of the week to make your decision, Miss Sinclair. Either honor our agreement or prepare to face the consequences. As the men rode away, Luke Donovan glanced back, his expression troubled. Hayes noticed the exchange, but focused on Lydia, whose composed demeanor finally cracked once the riders disappeared from view. He'll do it, she said quietly. He'll make sure I can't earn enough to live, let alone pay such a sum. Hayes guided her to a fallen log where they could sit. The territorial court would never enforce such an outrageous claim. But by the time that's determined, I'll be destitute in a frontier winter. Lydia's practical assessment of her situation only increased Hayes' admiration for her. No hysterics, just clear-eyed evaluation of the danger. You won't face this alone, he promised, the words emerging before he could consider their implications. Lydia looked at him with those perceptive blue eyes. Why are you helping me, Hayes? From everything I've observed and heard, you've kept Willow Creek at arm's length for years. You do your duty, but you don't get involved. The question struck at the heart of the change taking place within him. The walls he'd built beginning to crumble under the steady gaze of a woman who saw too clearly. I believed attachment was weakness, he admitted finally. That caring for anyone meant creating vulnerabilities enemies could exploit. What happened to make you believe that? Her voice was gentle, inviting confidences he rarely shared. Hayes looked out at the creek, seeing instead a burning homestead from 12 years earlier. Comanche raid when I was 14. My father died trying to protect my mother. I survived by hiding in the root cellar. Afterward, I learned that in the territories, the only person you can rely on is yourself. Lydia's hand found his, her touch warm and steady. I'm sorry for what happened to you. But Hayes, living without connection isn't survival. It's just existing. Her words echoed what he'd begun to realize himself these past weeks. The safety he'd built had become a prison, and Lydia Sinclair, with her courage and quiet strength, had somehow found the key. I'll speak with the territorial judge, Hayes said, returning to the immediate problem. Wade Donovan isn't the only one with connections. What he didn't say was that he would do whatever necessary to protect her. Not because it was his duty as sheriff, but because the thought of her being forced to marry Wade or driven from Willow Creek had become unthinkable. The situation escalated faster than Hayes anticipated. By the following morning, both the general store and Dr. Parsons had reluctantly informed Lydia they could no longer employ her. Mrs. Miller at the boarding house tearfully explained that pressure from the bank, where Wade held significant influence, meant she couldn't extend credit even to her most reliable tenant. It's happening exactly as he threatened, Lydia said when she met Hayes outside his office, her face composed despite the devastating news. 3 months of building a place here, gone in a single morning. Hayes felt a cold fury unlike anything he'd experienced in years. There are laws against this kind of intimidation. Laws that require evidence and take time to enforce, Lydia countered pragmatically. Time I don't have with winter approaching. Before Hayes could respond, a commotion down the street caught their attention. Luke Donovan was riding into town at a gallop, his horse lathered with exertion. He dismounted directly in front of them, his expression urgent. Sheriff, Miss Sinclair, you need to see this. He thrust a stack of papers into Hayes' hands. I found these in Wade's study. The original letters from Miss Sinclair, and drafts of the responses written by Fenton, his bookkeeper. Hayes scanned the documents, his jaw tightening. Here was the evidence of deliberate fraud. Notes in Wade's handwriting instructing his employee on the type of man to portray, the promises to make, all calculated to appeal to a woman seeking partnership rather than a business arrangement. There's more, Luke continued, lowering his voice. The inheritance clause is real, but what Wade didn't tell you is that if he isn't married by November 1st, the land passes to me. He's been trying to force me out of the ranch for years. This was his way of securing total control. Why are you showing us this? Hayes asked, studying the younger Donovan carefully. He's your brother. Luke's expression hardened. Because I watched him destroy 3 wives already. Because what he's doing to Miss Sinclair and to this town isn't right. He hesitated. And because those letters Miss Sinclair wrote, they described the kind of life I've always wanted but never thought possible. Someone who values hard work and simple dreams instead of empire building. Hayes saw the way Luke looked at Lydia, with admiration untainted by his brother's cold calculation. It sparked an unexpected flare of jealousy that Hayes immediately tried to suppress. "These will help with the territorial judge," Hayes said, carefully folding the papers. "But they won't stop Wade's influence in town immediately." "I have an idea about that too," Luke said. "But I'll need both of you to trust me." The plan was dangerous in its simplicity. Using the evidence Luke provided, Hayes would confront Wade publicly at the town meeting scheduled for that evening. Meanwhile, Luke would ensure his brother's most loyal men were occupied elsewhere, preventing any immediate retaliation. What Hayes hadn't anticipated was Lydia's insistence on being present for the confrontation. "This concerns me more directly than anyone," she argued when he attempted to convince her to remain at the boarding house. "I won't hide while others fight my battles." Standing in his office as sunset approached, Hayes found himself admiring her fierce determination even as he feared for her safety. "Wade Donovan is unpredictable when cornered." "So am I," Lydia replied with a hint of a smile. From her reticule, she withdrew a small Derringer pistol. "My father believed every woman should know how to protect herself." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "You've been carrying that since you arrived?" "A woman traveling alone learns caution, Sheriff." She returned the pistol to her reticule. "Though I prefer words to weapons when possible." The town hall filled quickly that evening, ostensibly to discuss winter preparations and road repairs. Hayes noted Wade's confident posture at the front of the room, surrounded by prominent businessmen but missing his usual ranch enforcers, just as Luke had promised. When the formal agenda concluded, Hayes stepped forward, documents in hand. The room quieted, sensing the tension in his stance. "Before we adjourn, there's a matter of justice that needs addressing," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Evidence has come to light of fraud and coercion being practiced against one of our citizens." Wade rose smoothly, his smile calculated to dispel concern. "Sheriff Barton, town meetings aren't the place for unsubstantiated allegations. If you have legitimate concerns, surely my office would be more appropriate. When the misconduct affects the entire community, the community deserves to hear it," Hayes countered, meeting Wade's gaze steadily. "You've used your influence to deprive Miss Sinclair of employment and housing based on fraudulent claims." Murmurs rippled through the gathered townsfolk. Wade's expression hardened, though his voice remained pleasant. "Miss Sinclair entered into a contract she's attempting to escape. Business disputes happen regularly on the frontier." "There was no legitimate contract," Hayes replied, holding up the papers. "These documents prove you deliberately misrepresented yourself, forged correspondence, and are now attempting to force Miss Sinclair into marriage through economic coercion." The murmurs grew louder as Wade's facade began to crack. "Where did you get those papers?" "From someone with a conscience," Hayes replied, not betraying Luke's involvement. "The territorial judge will receive copies tomorrow, along with statements from business owners who were pressured to dismiss Miss Sinclair." Several merchants shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to meet Lydia's gaze. Wade's charm disappeared entirely, replaced by cold fury. "You're exceeding your authority, Sheriff. Willow Creek exists because of my investments. These good people understand where their prosperity comes from. We also understand justice." Doc Parsons spoke up unexpectedly. "I didn't come west to become another man's puppet." "Nor did I," added Mrs. Peterson, rising with her infant in arms. "Miss Sinclair helped deliver my daughter when no one else was available. She's earned her place here." Others began to voice their support, emboldened by the first speakers. Hayes watched the shift in the room's energy with satisfaction, though he remained vigilant. Cornered men were unpredictable, and Wade Donovan had too much at stake to surrender easily. "This is absurd," Wade snapped, his control slipping further. "Miss Sinclair is contractually obligated." "To a man who doesn't exist," Lydia interrupted, stepping forward to stand beside Hayes. "The man described in those letters, the hard-working, honest rancher seeking partnership, was a fiction created to lure me west under false pretenses." Her clear voice and steady presence commanded attention. Hayes felt a surge of pride watching her face down the man who'd tried to manipulate her future. "I came to Montana seeking a new beginning with someone who valued the same things I do," she continued. "Instead, I found deception. But I also found a community of good people who've shown me what the frontier truly offers." not easy wealth, but the chance to build something meaningful through honest work and genuine connections. The room had fallen completely silent, every face turned toward Lydia. Even Wade seemed momentarily at a loss for words. "The contract is void," Hayes stated into the silence. "And any further attempts to interfere with Miss Sinclair's life in this town will be met with legal consequences." For a moment, it seemed they had won. Then Wade's expression shifted to something more dangerous than anger: calculation. "Very moving, Sheriff." "Miss Sinclair." Wade's voice dripped with contempt. "But I wonder if your passionate defense has more personal motivations? Our upstanding sheriff seems unusually concerned with one particular citizen's welfare." The insinuation rippled through the room. Hayes felt Lydia tense beside him. "My duty extends to all citizens facing intimidation," Hayes replied evenly. "Of course. How fortunate that your duty aligns so conveniently with your apparent personal interests." Wade's smile was razor-sharp. "Tell me, Sheriff, does your badge give you the right to court another man's fiancée? Or perhaps Miss Sinclair has been securing your protection through means the good people of Willow Creek might find shocking." The accusation struck like a physical blow. Before Hayes could respond, Lydia stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "Mr. Donovan, you have attempted to buy me like cattle, threaten me into submission, and now you would slander my character and that of a man who has done nothing but uphold the law." Her voice trembled not with fear, but with controlled fury. "If you were half the man Sheriff Barton is, you wouldn't need to trick women into marriage." A ripple of shocked approval ran through the crowd. Wade's face darkened, his hand moving toward his jacket where Hayes knew he carried a derringer similar to Lydia's. "I wouldn't," Hayes warned, his own hand hovering near his holster. The moment balanced on a knife's edge until Luke Donovan pushed through the crowd to stand between his brother and Hayes. "That's enough, Wade," Luke said firmly. "It's over. The evidence is clear, and you've lost the town's support." Wade's gaze shifted to his brother, comprehension dawning. "You," he hissed. "You betrayed me." "I stopped you from destroying another life," Luke countered, "and from dragging our family name further through the mud." For one tense moment, Hayes thought Wade might draw his weapon despite the witnesses. Instead, the older Donovan straightened his jacket with deliberate calm. "This isn't finished," he said quietly enough that only those closest could hear. "Enjoy your moral victory while it lasts." As Wade pushed his way through the crowd toward the exit, the tension in the room gradually dissipated. People clustered around Lydia, offering support and, in some cases, apologies for their earlier unwillingness to stand against Wade's pressure. Hayes watched her accept their words with grace, her natural warmth drawing people closer. The community that had initially viewed her with suspicion now rallied around her, proof that she'd built genuine connections while he'd been guarding his isolation. "You've changed Willow Creek in just a few months," Hayes observed when they finally had a moment alone outside the town hall. The night air carried the crisp scent of approaching winter, stars brilliant above them. "I think perhaps Willow Creek changed me," Lydia replied thoughtfully. "I came seeking safety and found purpose instead." Hayes hesitated, then offered what he'd been considering throughout the meeting. "The Territorial Marshal's office in Helena has requested my help with several cases. I'll need to leave for 2 weeks at most. With Wade's threat still lingering, I'm concerned for your safety while I'm gone." Lydia studied his face in the lamplight. "I have friends here now, Hayes. I'll be careful. All the same, I'd feel better knowing you had extra protection." He cleared his throat. "Luke Donovan has offered you accommodation at the foreman's cabin on the far side of the ranch property, well away from the main house, where Wade stays. Luke would ensure your safety." Something shifted in Lydia's expression. "Luke offered this. He feels responsible for his brother's actions," Hayes explained, trying to ignore the discomfort he felt at the arrangement. "The cabin is secure, isolated from town pressures, and would give Wade time to cool his temper." "And you trust Luke Donovan?" Lydia asked carefully. Hayes nodded, though it cost him to admit it. He risked everything to provide evidence against his own brother. And he's a good man, honest, hardworking. The kind of man those letters pretended Wade was. The kind of man who could offer Lydia the partnership she'd traveled west seeking. Hayes acknowledged silently. The thought created a hollow ache in his chest, but he pushed it aside. His feelings weren't what mattered here. Lydia's safety and happiness were the priority. "I see," Lydia said softly, her eyes never leaving his face. And you believe this is the best solution? I believe it's the safest option while I'm away, Hayes replied carefully. Lydia was quiet for a long moment. Very well. Please tell Mr. Donovan I accept his offer. Hayes nodded, telling himself the tight feeling in his chest was merely concern for a citizen under his protection. Nothing more. The territorial marshal's investigation took Hayes to 3 different settlements across Montana, tracking counterfeit currency that appeared linked to several wealthy ranchers, possibly including Wade Donovan. The work should have provided the kind of clear purpose Hayes had always found in his duties, but he found himself distracted, thoughts constantly returning to Willow Creek and to Lydia. Each passing day increased his restlessness until he finally managed to complete the investigation in 10 days rather than the expected 14. When he rode into Willow Creek shortly after dawn on the 11th day, the town was stirring to life, unaware of his early return. Hayes stopped first at his office to leave reports before heading to the boarding house, only to be told by Mrs. Miller that Lydia hadn't returned from the Donovan ranch. Been out there the whole time you've been gone, Mrs. Miller added with a knowing smile that increased Hayes' discomfort. Young Luke rides into town most days, and folks have noticed he always asks after Miss Sinclair's things here. Romantic, if you ask me, him offering shelter after standing up to his brother like that. Hayes thanked her and left, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in his stomach. Of course, Lydia and Luke would have grown closer during his absence. Luke could offer everything the letters had promised, a life building something together, a partnership of equals on a prosperous ranch once Wade's claim was invalidated. It made perfect sense. It was the natural outcome. And it left Hayes feeling hollow in a way he hadn't experienced since watching his childhood home burn. Rather than immediately riding to the Donovan ranch, Hayes spent the morning catching up on town business, telling himself he was merely being thorough. By mid-afternoon, however, he could delay no longer and saddled his horse for the hour-long ride. The Broken D Ranch spread across several thousand acres of prime grazing land. Hayes bypassed the main house and rode directly to the foreman's cabin situated near a small creek at the property's eastern edge. As he approached, he saw smoke rising from the chimney and 2 horses in the small corral. One he recognized as Lydia's rented mare from the town stable. The door opened before he could dismount, and Lydia stepped onto the porch, shielding her eyes against the autumn sun. The sight of her, hair loose around her shoulders, wearing a simple blue dress, made Hayes realize how deeply he'd missed her. Hayes, her face lit with genuine pleasure as she hurried down the steps. You're back early. Investigation wrapped up sooner than expected, he replied, dismounting and removing his hat. I wanted to make sure everything was all right here. Everything's fine, she assured him, though something in her expression suggested complexity beyond her words. Luke has been the perfect gentleman, ensuring I have everything I need while keeping Wade at a distance. As if summoned by his name, Luke emerged from the cabin, nodding in greeting. Sheriff, good to see you back safely. Hayes noted the comfortable familiarity between them with a pang he tried to suppress. Any trouble with Wade? He left for Helena 3 days ago, Luke reported. Business with the Territorial Bank, supposedly, though I suspect he's trying to salvage what he can before the fraud allegations become public. You're welcome to come inside, Lydia offered, gesturing toward the cabin. I've just made coffee. The interior of the small cabin was neat and homey, with wildflowers in a mason jar on the table and the scent of baking in the air. Hayes couldn't help noticing how naturally Lydia moved through the space, as though she belonged there. As they discussed the developments of the past 10 days, Hayes observed the easy rapport between Lydia and Luke, the way they anticipated each other's thoughts, shared small smiles over private references, finished each other's sentences. It confirmed what he'd suspected. In his absence, they'd formed a connection that made perfect sense for both of them. The territorial judge will arrive next week to review the case, Hayes informed them, setting down his coffee cup. With the evidence we have, Wade's claim should be dismissed, and the inheritance will transfer to Luke as specified in the original document. And Wade? Lydia asked. Fraud charges are possible, though difficult to prove fully. At minimum, his reputation will suffer considerably. Hayes turned to Luke. You'll have full control of the ranch once the ruling is made. Luke nodded thoughtfully. Been thinking about that. Ranch this size doesn't need to stay undivided. The eastern section, including this cabin, could be parceled off as a separate holding. The implication hung in the air. Hayes forced himself to acknowledge it directly. A good start for someone looking to build something of their own. That's what I was thinking, Luke agreed, glancing at Lydia with an expression Hayes recognized all too well. Hope mingled with uncertainty, the look of a man who saw his future sitting across the table. It sounds like you two have been making plans, Hayes said, keeping his voice neutral through sheer force of will. Lydia's eyes met his, something unreadable in their blue depths. We've had many conversations about possibilities. I should leave you to them then. Hayes rose, suddenly needing to escape the domestic scene that underscored everything he'd denied himself over the years. I just wanted to ensure you were safe, Miss Sinclair. I'll send word when the judge arrives. Lydia followed him outside, her expression troubled. Hayes, wait. He paused beside his horse, hat in hand. The afternoon sun caught in her hair, turning it to spun gold against the backdrop of mountains and open sky. I'm glad you found what you were looking for, he said quietly. Luke Donovan is a good man. He can offer you the life those letters promised. Lydia studied him with that perceptive gaze that always seemed to see too much. Is that what you think has happened here? Isn't it? Hayes asked, gesturing toward the cabin. This is the dream you described, building something meaningful with a partner who values the same things you do. Yes, Luke and I have discussed many possibilities, Lydia agreed, stepping closer, including the possibility that his cabin would make a perfect home for a newly appointed deputy marshal and his wife, should that deputy wish to continue serving the territory while maintaining roots near Willow Creek. Hayes stared at her, processing her words slowly. I don't understand. The territorial marshal was impressed with your work on the counterfeiting case, Luke said, joining them. He mentioned to me before you returned that he's looking to appoint a deputy for this region. Said you'd be his first choice if you were interested. And the cabin? Hayes asked, confusion giving way to a fragile hope. Would be my wedding gift to you both, Luke replied with a crooked smile. If you'd finally get around to telling Lydia how you feel about her. Hayes looked between them, understanding dawning. You're not courting? Lydia finished, a smile tugging at her lips. No, Hayes. Luke and I have become friends. Good friends who have spent considerable time discussing a certain sheriff who believes attachment is weakness, yet can't stop himself from caring anyway. The walls Hayes had built so carefully over the years crumbled completely under the weight of the moment. I thought, when I saw how well you fit together. We get along because we share one fundamental truth, Lydia said softly. We both care deeply about you, in different ways. Luke cleared his throat. I'll, check on that fence line we discussed, Lydia. Sheriff. With a knowing nod, he mounted his horse and rode toward the distant pasture, leaving them alone. In the silence that followed, Hayes found himself at a loss for words. A man who had spent his adult life maintaining control suddenly unable to articulate the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. I've spent 10 days wondering if you would come back and finally say what your eyes have been telling me for months, Lydia said, her voice gentle but direct. Or if I would need to be the one brave enough to speak first. Lydia, Hayes began, then stopped, searching for the right words. I've spent 12 years believing that caring for anyone meant creating a vulnerability I couldn't afford. That isolation was the price of survival. And now, she prompted, her eyes never leaving his face. Now I understand that surviving isn't the same as living, he admitted, echoing her words from weeks earlier. These past 10 days showed me that the safety I built was empty without someone to share it with. He stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of darker blue in her eyes. I rode back to Willow Creek, convinced I'd lost something I never allowed myself to claim in the first place. Something I didn't believe I deserved. And what was that? Lydia asked, though the softness in her expression suggested she already knew. You, Hayes answered simply. The chance to build something meaningful together. Not because of some letter or contract, but because we chose each other freely. Lydia's smile bloomed fully then, radiant against the backdrop of mountains and autumn-painted trees. I've been waiting for you to choose me, Hayes Barton. Ever since that first day when you stood between me and a future I didn't want. I choose you, he said, the words feeling like both a promise and a liberation. If you'll have a man who's only now learning that strength can come from connection rather than isolation, I believe I'll take my chances with him, Lydia replied, her eyes bright with emotion. After all, I came west seeking adventure. When Hayes finally gathered her into his arms, the kiss they shared felt like coming home to a place he'd never known existed, a sanctuary built not of walls and solitude, but of trust and shared dreams. Willow Creek, Montana Territory, Spring 1879. The territorial judge not only invalidated Wade Donovan's fraudulent claims against Lydia, but also appointed Hayes as deputy marshal for the northern Montana region. Wade himself had fled to California after the counterfeiting investigation implicated several of his business associates, leaving Luke to reshape the Broken D Ranch into something more aligned with his own values. The small cabin by the creek became home to Hayes and Lydia following their winter wedding, a celebration that brought together the entire community that had once witnessed their public stand against intimidation. On this particular morning, Hayes stood on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the distant mountains gold. Inside, he could hear Lydia moving about, preparing for their trip into town where she now ran the general store with Mrs. Peterson as her partner. "Another beautiful day," Lydia observed, joining him on the porch and handing him a cup of coffee. Hayes took the cup with one hand, his other arm circling her waist to draw her close. "I still find it hard to believe sometimes." "What?" "That spring finally arrived," Lydia teased, though she knew exactly what he meant. "That I found something I wasn't even looking for," Hayes replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. A woman brave enough to cross a continent alone, stand her ground against intimidation, and then choose a man who'd forgotten how to dream. Lydia smiled up at him, her blue eyes reflecting the morning light. "I didn't choose the wrong cowboy after all. I chose the man who chose me right back." Together they watched the sun climb higher, illuminating the life they were building, one founded not on isolation or false promises, but on a partnership freely chosen, strengthening them both against whatever the frontier might bring.